afternoon, everyone. It is July 27th, and I'm calling to order the meeting of the Pinole Historic Preservation Committee. Let's see, call to order. That is now. And Alex, would you kindly do roll call for us?
Yes. Let's start with Commissioner Moriarty.
Present.
Commissioner Banuelos.
Here.
Mayor Martinez-Rubin.
Here.
Yeah, and Councilmember Toms is currently absent, but has expressed that she'll be joining soon, and Commissioner Martinez has notified us that he is unavailable to attend tonight.
Thank you very much. And present with us is also staff, Mr. David Hannum, Michael Laughlin, and Assistant City Attorney Alex Mock. Thank you very much, everyone. And behind us, supporting this, today's presentation and broadcasting is the Pinole PCTV Pinole broadcast channel. And this is being live streamed, I believe, and also appearing on Comcast Channel 26. Just having joined us, popping in on Zoom is Councilmember Maureen Toms. Thank you, everyone. So as in the past, during our previous meeting, this meeting is being run via Zoom with a couple of features that we are continuing to test out. Each speaker, when I open the public comment period, each speaker will be afforded 3 minutes to speak. Speakers will be muted until their opportunity to provide public comment if there are more than one person in waiting to be admitted as an attendee. Video will be turned off for public participants. And please use the raise hand feature or press *9 if you are connecting via phone. This will alert staff or anyone else on the screen that you'll have a comment to provide. So thank you for bearing with us as we continue learning about the use of different Zoom features. And now I will open up the public comment period. And as we are waiting for the first person to raise their hand or be admitted into the room, on the screen, we see that in order to submit public comments, you could have submitted something in writing to one of our staff members, Mr. David Hannum at cipinole.ca.us. I'll ask Mr. Hannum if you received any written comments.
At this point, I don't see any comments.
Thank you very much. And then the webinar ID, should you wish to join us, 819-2111-8727 using the Zoom app. So comments received before the close of the public comment period for tonight, for this afternoon, will be read into the record and limited to 3 minutes. Please include your full name, city of residence, and the agenda item you are commenting on. So I understand we have one attendee, and
Mayor, at this time, no one has indicated they wish to speak.
No one is indicating they wish to speak. Okay. All right, then. I will close the public comment period, and we will continue. And this afternoon, we have a presentation on historic preservation by Mr. Jonathan Jarvis, who is a retired director of the National Park Service. Mr. Jarvis.
Good afternoon, Mayor and the committee. Thank you for the invitation to present. I want to say up front that I'm not presenting as an advocate for historic preservation, but more as a resource for all of you, because I've worked in the professional side of historic preservation for 40 years, including serving as the director of the National Park Service. And so in many ways, this quote at the bottom, the nation is coming to understand that people do not have to settle for homogenization of America in which our individual identities and our sense of place is lost. And that's, I think, the core of historic preservation in America is around sort of preventing loss to places that evoke a lot of great history and emotion, and Pinole certainly has that. So I'm going to run through about about 15 or 20 slides and kind of cover the basics on historic preservation, and then run over kind of the top 10 myths of historic preservation. And they're all just for your benefit, for the community's benefit, around consideration of this ordinance. So next slide, please. I live in Pinole on Samuel Street. We have a historic home, 1914 Craftsman. We've been here since 2002. So we consider ourselves, this is home. Next slide, please. As you can see, I started early in my career and worked for 40 years in the field and as the regional director here in California over the 58 parks in the West, and then in Washington as the 18th director of the Park Service. Next slide, please. So most people you think of the National Park Service as running Yosemite and the Grand Canyon, but actually the National Park Service is the historic preservation office of the nation. We manage over 200 historical sites, from presidential homes to battlefields. We manage the National Register of Historic Places. The keeper of the National Register is a National Park Service employee. We designate National Historic Landmarks. We fund the state historic preservation offices across the nation. We certify the federal tax credit, the 20% tax credit, billions of dollars a year in renovation of historic properties. We oversee the Secretary's Standard for Historic Preservation, and we develop specific treatments for historic properties of all sorts and teach those preservation skills in our Preservation Training Center back east. So a big role for the National Park Service. And again, I'm not trying to sell any of you on any of this. I'm just trying to offer that. And me as a resource, as a Pinole resident, I have overseen all of these programs in the past. Next slide. So historic preservation can be sort of put on a scale. And the very least restrictive of a preservation overlay is really a voluntary overlay, which is sort of what we have now in Pinole, where people sort of adopt preservation style and architecture to their homes. Sort of the next step up, which is not much of a big leap, is this ordinance that's being considered. And these are very flexible ways that preservation can be maintained in a place like Pinole. If you want to go higher, then you're really moving up the scale towards true designations, and they can be state designations, they can be additional properties on the National Register of Historic Places. Then the next step up is the National Historic Landmark, and then you could even go for some larger designation. Just to give you a sense, there are over 80,000 National Register properties in the United States, and most of them are privately owned. So there really is sort of life after listing if you do wind up going down that path, but we really want to make a break here between very light touch to the more restrictive. And we're in the consideration on the very light touch side of this. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of California towns that have embraced historic preservation to maintain their core character. These are just two examples. In California, there are many of them that have recognized that they wanted to maintain a sense of architectural style and history, while at the same time developing, an economy, tourism, and the like. Next slide. As you all know, Pinole has only two properties that are actually on the National Register, that being the bank building and the Fernandez House. And so, I don't think anybody's considering expanding that, but it's nice to know that we have two very representative historic structures already on the National Register of Historic Places. Next slide, please. That said, Pinole has a lot of other structures that contribute to the overall architectural vernacular of the city of Pinole and the historic downtown. And interestingly, there are a variety of different styles, from hip roof to gable structures to craftsman bungalows to adobe. there's just a nice mix in many ways from the history of this town, and all of those are adaptable to future development. Next slide, please. So there have been literally dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of studies about the benefits of historic preservation. And one of them that is often overlooked but needs to be emphasized is particularly the economic benefits. And towns that have embraced it, we have definitely recognized that they maintain kind of a feel, a sort of an eclectic feel. And that's something that I think most people in Pinole feel about their community. In most cases, property values have either remained stable during the ups and downs that we often have here in the Bay Area, and often appreciate more quickly in periods of upswing in the economics. And that new construction, which incorporates these historical architectural designs, can be very creative and fit in quite well. Next slide, please. So studies have shown not just economics, but they can be attract small businesses. They can be used for affordable housing. They are quite sustainable if you think about all the energy development that's already in an existing structure. They can stabilize neighborhoods. They can be a center, a city center that can kind of expand out. Job creation, there's a lot of really great preservation skills that can be developed and applied within a historic preservation area. They obviously promote architecture, art, and culture, and they can create opportunities for small town renewal. And heritage tourism, something that I know a lot about, is a growing field, people wanting to go to communities that have preserved their history. Next slide. And I'll mention on the bottom of all these slides, there is the reference for all of this information that you can go to on the web and pull these up. So sort of the three top sort of findings of these studies are that they increase property values, certainly during stable periods. They have job creation, and they can increase heritage tourism. People that are traveling these days, particularly in the U.S., we're getting a huge spike in domestic tourism, and those folks spend money when they travel. Next slide. So I'm going to click through these top 10 myths of historic preservation. They come from Ken Bernstein, who's the former director of preservation in the LA County, LA Conservancy. So number one, if property gets designated historic, it's protected forever and can never be demolished. That's just not true. Historic properties, and I know many of them, have been demolished and can be. There's a documentation process you go through, but it does not prohibit demolition. Next slide. It will reduce my property values, and as I mentioned earlier, study after study, research, well documented that this is just a myth, that in most cases it increases property values. Next slide. I won't be able to change it if it's in this district, and I don't want my house to be a museum. Actually, they can make a lot of changes, very significant changes in properties. It just goes through a little bit longer review process, and often a lot of information provided about how to make the changes in a way that maintains the integrity of the aesthetic of the building to make sure it fits with the past look of the area. Next slide. Preservation is only for the rich. Well, that's not true. Or for the high style buildings. Increasingly, preservation in the United States is recognizing the historical importance of all people, particularly being more inclusive, recognizing diversity and environmental justice. And so it is absolutely increasingly diverse and recognizing all contributors across our history. Next slide, please. It's bad for business, and that's just completely mythology. In many cases, historic preservation has been at the heart of economic redevelopment of communities and business attraction. Businesses that today can be located almost anywhere because of remote office work. People are attracted to communities that have been preserved for their history. Next slide. It's more expensive than new construction. This can be true. It can cost a bit more at times, but it can also be more cost effective than new construction. And often buildings, actually historic buildings, tend to persist longer in cases of fire or flood or earthquake here in the Bay Area than some new construction. Next slide, please. There's going to be a lot of money coming to you if you get designated. That's another myth. It's one that's repeated commonly, but there are some grant programs. They are generally only for structures that are on the National Register of Historic Properties or on the National Historic Landmarks Program. There are a few sort of nonprofits out there like the National Trust for Historic Preservation and others that grant, but generally, no, there's not going to be a lot of federal or state money coming in to help, particularly an individual on preservation. There can be tax credits and for some properties, and that's worth checking out, particularly for the 2 National Register properties, but generally there's no new tons of money coming in. Next slide, please. Old buildings are less safe. Sometimes they do require structural reinforcement. I had to do it here at my house. My old Craftsman needed to be bolted to the foundation, which it wasn't. But they often perform quite well during earthquakes and other natural disasters. So old construction can be quite good, and so that's something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. It's a violation of property rights, and we hear a lot about property rights these days. But we live in a society that has rules and regulations, on what you can do on your property. I could not open a used car lot on this property because the city wouldn't allow that, and historic preservation is no different than that in terms of its imposition on our rights. Next slide, please. And that the preservation community is always fighting new development, and our preservation community, they do care about the past, but they recognize that our communities are on the move and that we need to attract economic development. And I think the core value is really around trying to preserve something from being lost in terms of the character of these communities across the country. And there can be lots of positive benefits of working directly with the preservation community and finding solutions, particularly when new development is being proposed. Next slide, and I think that's my last ones. And so I am available for any questions for any of you, if you want to go deeper on any of this, and I can provide, as I indicated, references to all of these facts and studies.
Thank you, Mr. Jarvis, for your presentation. Committee members, questions on Mr. Jarvis's presentation? And this goes for staff as well. Councilmember Toms.
Yeah, just a question with the fact that you've been in Pinole for a number of years. Are there any properties that you would think would be close to being designated if we had applied for designation for the registry?
I think there are some homes that have been well maintained and still carry that historical architectural style that would probably meet the National Register properties. A lot of the National Register property designations are predominantly just for the exterior of the building, and inside you could have a completely modern kitchen and everything, renovated. And really what you're looking for is something that is the exterior. And I don't know off the top of my head, but I still think there are buildings in the historic district area of Pinole that you could pitch for a designation. That is a bit of a process. I will warn you, though, that the nomination process is a lot of work. You have to really put together a lot of documentation and submit it to the National Park Service. The State Historic Preservation Office is generally there to help with that. And often the first step is to go to the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office for California, and ask for a state designation. And that generally sort of makes it easier to get on the National Register.
Got it. Thank you.
In your question, Councilmember Tom's, makes me think of I believe it was the first or second slide that Mr. Jarvis had about the different levels of preservation and how we are in our attempt at putting together an ordinance and have the hearings and eventually consider its existence is on the lighter side. It's not in the interest of having an increasing number of homes become part of that National Register, but rather to preserve those that exist and build upon those that exist. I do think about the images that were on one of the slides, and we know that some of those buildings don't exist anymore. Some for reasons for safety, and so there was one slide that mentioned that demolition can occur, and one primary reason is because the structure is considered unsafe. In fact, I think there might have been some buildings next to the Pinole Bank that had to be demolished after the 1989 earthquake, and so we don't have those anymore. I also think about the structure that used to be what I remember fondly, the home of the lazy aged beef that was at the corner of Pinole Valley Road and Pear Street, and was a grocery store and isn't there anymore. And that was private property and has remained an empty lot for a number of years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the food center at Tennant and Pear.
Yes. Yeah. Commissioner Moriarty.
I assume that's me. I think I lost you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, all right. Thanks so much for that presentation, Mr. Jarvis. And I had a question. You listed all the benefits and the pros, basically, of a community having some level of historic preservation. I'm wondering if you are aware of, as far at the community level and perhaps at the individual level as well, of there being any cons to having a historic preservation overlay like we are speaking of, or something even more, I guess I wouldn't go more restrictive because we're not going there. So are you aware of anything that would say this is not a good idea to head towards?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anne. It's a good question. I think that most of the cons come from individual actions on properties within whatever ordinance zone that you create. And I think that they can be avoided by having a fair amount of flexibility in how you apply it, and being very open with the public about what's okay and what's not, and being open to when buildings are under construction, there's going to be a mess, and you don't have to be perfect all the time. There can be temporary intrusions that can be, so it really is, I think the cons that I have experienced is when the city is a little too restrictive, a little too harsh, a little bit too quick on the reaction, and it doesn't work with the community because these are private properties. These are and they have to be respected. And I think it's worked most successfully when the community feels they have a voice and they're engaged, and they want to do something, and they get someone that they can work with to sort of resolve their concerns or issues. The cons come when, the city slams down on them and says, no, you just can't do that, rather than saying, how can we get to yes? And I think that's where, historically out there, that a lot of the opposition to preservation has come from, where it has been an imposition on communities, and they feel that is unfair or, impinges on their rights.
Great. So it sounds like communication is a big deal.
It is a very big deal. Yeah, it's a very, you probably can't over communicate these kinds of steps forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Anything else? Well, we know that Mr. Jarvis is available as a resource. He is a resident of Pinole. We are fortunate to have such a resident with the background that he does. Unbeknownst to me all these years, I think we just have not crossed paths up until fairly recently. And I appreciate that you joined us for the committee and prepared this presentation for us.
Mayor, if you may just want to see if there's any members of the public who wish to comment before you move on to the next.
Sure, thank you. I still see Mr. Rupert as attendee, but I don't know whether he is going to speak or has any questions. Can someone let me know whether that is the case? How can we tell whether he is interested?
It does not appear that he has his hand raised.
Okay. All right, thank you. So I will move on then. So I think this background information for us was as a reference as well, and as a resource for us to consider the reason why we even started thinking about a preservation ordinance in Pinole was to think about the value of the character that is an old town, and also building upon the sense of and desire of compatibility for any new developments. Now, Old Town is largely built, so we're not talking about too many new structures that are going to occur. There are only a few lots that would be available for any new construction. However, there are buildings, whether they be commercial or residential, that might come before staff as a matter of renovation. And so that's why there's also a section in the guidelines that speak to that, and we'll get to that as part of the agenda as well. So thank you, Mr. Jarvis. Please stay with us if you are available. Otherwise, we're going to move on and continue on with our agenda. The next item is to discuss the overlay ordinance and the overlay map. And Alex, did you have some specific guiding questions?
Yeah, so I'll just by way of refresher, the committee may remember, I'm sure you all know that the proposed ordinance that went to the Planning Commission and went to the City Council is structured such that there is a historic preservation zone. Whenever any type of project occurs within that zone, the project would go to the zoning administrator, who in this case is Dave, to review and determine whether it would impact any cultural resource, whether that project would impact any cultural resource. So that could be impact a cultural resource that's next door, or impact, if the structure itself is a cultural resource. And there's a definition of cultural resource in the draft ordinance. If and it includes, buildings that are representative of, a certain architectural style or have other historic significance, or an area that has particular significance. And then if it is determined that the project would impact a cultural resource, then the project would be subject to the Old Town Design Guidelines. And it'd be those Old Town Design Guidelines would be applied through the otherwise normal design review process. So, you know, I'm oversimplifying, but large projects would go to the Planning Commission. Smaller projects would be reviewed administratively, just like they are now. That wouldn't change at all. And so the focal points for discussion have been, first, sort of just initially, is the map of Old Town correct? Is it too big? Should it be narrowed a little bit? There's been some discussion about some particular areas that perhaps could be excluded. Second issue was whether or not, you know, this is something that should be handled by the zoning administrator or you know, handled by the Planning Commission, or you know, just a third option, just being taken that step out completely and just say the design review guidelines apply to everything, all projects within Old Town Pinole, just for simplicity. So those were that's sort of the overview, and that's what we began to discuss at the last meeting. I don't think we really had that much opportunity to dive into the meat of those issues much. People were sort of expressing more general opinions about, you know, the ordinance and various items, and, you know, would this be a burden on property owners? How stringent would this be? And so I would defer to the mayor. I think the map is probably the easier to tackle first. So I don't know if that is you prefer to discuss the map first, or if it's you want to discuss the ordinance more. And I'm happy to, you know, structure that conversation however you want, and have some more structure when we talk about the ordinance as well.
Thank you, Alex. So let's talk about where we are talking about. So it is that overlay, and I do want to get an explanation of the map, because if I were to see it, and granted this is a draft, I am wondering, one, where I am, and second, what the green and the red boundary lines reflect. So please.
Yeah, so hopefully you can see that now that's being shared. This Old Town map, this map of Old Town Pinole, came from the Old Town Design Guidelines that were adopted back in 1997 or so. And so that is where this comes from. I'm trying to zoom out a little bit, but I'm having a little bit of trouble. There we go. And then the two areas that are shown here, the one in green, the reason these have been highlighting, and this is just for ease of discussion really, is at the last meeting, there was some discussion of whether these homes, which are, you know, in between the railroad tracks, basically in the waterfront, but aren't along Tennant Avenue, whether or not those should be included in the Old Town. You know, it's a newer subdivision, and it's not really that visible from Tennant Avenue, sort of as a major thoroughfare. So that was one area sort of major discussion. There was alternatively a discussion of, well, instead of excluding that area, if we want to include it, that row of houses that is not shaded, that's directly adjacent to the green line, that should be included as well, because there's no reason to not include that area if we're including the rest. And then the red area is down by Collins School, as well as the areas that have been redeveloped where Sprouts is and Kaiser. And there was some discussion of, well, that's been redeveloped as sort of, it's pretty modern now. Perhaps we should exclude that from the Old Town Design Guidelines. Another point of view was that, well, this is still a gateway to Pinole. I don't know if that's really where we would consider the entry place to Old Town Pinole, but it's certainly, you know, something you drive past on your way to Old Town Pinole. And so we want to still have it within the zone. And, you know, if and when they redevelop again in the future, we want to make sure that, you know, historic aspects were taken into consideration as well. So those were the two areas we discussed, or that were raised. I don't think there was really a consensus reached about either one. I don't think it was directly sort of a point of discussion. So I would, Mayor, I welcome it to you if you want to hear from the commission's thoughts on those areas or any other potential changes to the map.
Yes, absolutely. And Councilmember Thompson's got her hand up. So
yeah. So thank you for the green. The area surrounded in green. I was sort of an advocate of, let's take that out because it was a subdivision from the 1950s. But I have since learned from some, longtime Pinole residents that was our first major subdivision in Pinole. And then also Commissioner Banuelos convinced me that, there is value in some of these 1950s sort of retro. He's got an architectural name for the design. So there is value in those. And I would suggest that, if they're retained, that we add the properties that back up against the creek. And then as far as the area in red, even though, Collins Elementary School wouldn't be subject to any of our zoning codes, if there were any reconstruction, the school district is generally very sensitive to design guidelines, similar to how when Pinole Middle School was reconstructed, they did take a look at historic architecture in Pinole and sort of modeled that design after that. And even though Sprouts is already constructed, as is Kaiser, I would look at the bowling alley and see that there's potential for, redevelopment of that site sometime in the future. So it would make sense to just keep that whole area in the overlay zone.
thank you. My guess is that the homes adjacent to that green border, that line, that are not shaded right now, were built at the same time as those that are shaded. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So that convinces me that they ought to be included as well. With regard to the other area near Sprouts, I'm thinking more along the lines of the homes in front of Collins, which are included in the overlay right now, because there are some homes there that have been remodeled, but they are older homes, probably built in the 40s, if not earlier. Yeah. Okay. Any other committee members comments on the map? Any differences in opinion?
Madam Mayor, the term that I had told Councilmember Toms for the green area is a big generic thing. It's called mid-century modern architecture, and it's kind of lands during the late 40s to early 60s, kind of generally in that big swath of time. And it is a wide group of lots of different things. From the late 50s, actually late 40s, actually, there's these small little houses that you see that were kind of houses for servicemen coming back from World War II. And they're everywhere in the Bay Area, and people kind of ignore them or tear them down or change them totally. That's where that starts. And then you get into things like Eichler built houses, which we don't really have. And generally just the ranch house is the primary of that, which is an offshoot of prairie houses from Frank Lloyd Wright. So watered down, immensely. But a lot of these that we're seeing here in this neighborhood area, as an example, it went in to more or less together as a group, as opposed to one at a time, like some of the earlier houses that we have in various places in Old Town. They were one at a time, or maybe two at a time. Some of these neighborhoods have gone in entire groups. So, and that kind of went back to my comment in the last meeting about looking at things from a historic manner is not static. Our meeting itself that we're thinking of this is historic. We're making history right now by having the meeting. And, things keep going. And I do agree with you, what you said about the house across from the new development, being in that, and it already is, and the area on the Collins School side and the new development staying within that. In the future, there's maybe something will come, as a result of the bowling area. And in 50 years, something may come, the new development may be tired, and someone want to do something with that as well, and then at that time in the future, they may want to, ironically, may want to take into account what's there now as an element of history. That may not be a great example, of history, but, different eyes see different things during just different periods. And so I'm in favor of keeping the green and the red areas within this zone, because even within the zone as we have now, we have a lot of variation, but they still fall into this big mold of Old Town Pinole. And that's where whatever specific guidelines to Old Town are modified or developed, modified more and that kind of thing. We just have to make sure that we're not being too, and I'll use this as an example, too Victorian centric, because not every house in there is Victorians. We have the houses that we see across the way there in the green area. We have craftsman houses. We have all kinds of different types. The other thing that would occur within the National Register of Historic Place type designation, if you went that far, is it's not as much as the house, but who lived there. As an example, there's a house here near the train trestle, I believe, that was a former house of, I'm blanking the name of the guy from Clarence Creekwater Revival, the band, John Fogerty, wasn't it?
It was his wife, his former wife.
Yeah, but didn't he have a sound studio there at one time and all that? So it's. I don't
think so, but
that's what I read, and I think some of the historical society's documents. So even it's not much as much as how it looks as what was there, and sometimes that's how that's dealt with. I've done projects being involved with SHPO in the past, but specifically the Fox Theater in Oakland, if you're aware of that. I worked on that at one time, and it's a very arduous process. And they're very, very picky, because even the federal stuff goes through the state. And I think we need to make sure we have flexibility that if people want to do that, they can do that, for their own houses. And I'm really glad that our speakers mentioned all these myths and kind of said, here's what's really going on. That was really informative in terms of that, because I know some of those things I thought myself, and now I know better. So, So I think, when we look at guidelines for this area, we have to be cognizant of all the times, as well as, the obvious ones. Because we have, and even just in Old Town on its own, it's a microcosm of a lot of different areas, a lot of different times. And I did find my book that I had, it's called Rehab Right. It's a City of Oakland book. And Maureen, you might have seen that at one time, about the different time periods of houses in Oakland, which is very parallel to to what you see everywhere else in the Bay Area, including Pinole. I gave that to Dave to take a look at. So that's pretty much all I had to say for this.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Pinole. So even before the musicians or family members of a famous band occupied the home above or near the train tracks above the trellis, Manuel Fernandez, Dr. Manuel Fernandez, who also related to the Fernandez occupants of the Fernandez mansion, the builders of that, and at one time the wharf in that area, occupied that. And so it is a historic home. The value of it as a historic home at this point is dependent on the extent that the current occupants believe it is, and to what degree they're preserving its appearance and its character. And so that speaks to, again, the voluntary nature of any occupant, of any resident in this overlay to continue preserving what they have. And maintain the variety of architectural styles that encompass the Old Town area. So, okay. Alex, I think.
So just to reiterate, what I'm hearing from the committee is that keep the map as is with no changes except to add that row of houses adjacent to the green line that is not highlighted, add that into the overlay, but otherwise to keep it as is.
Yes.
Perfect. And let me stop sharing. So the next point to bring up is the ordinance itself, in the role of the zoning administrator. I'm going to share my screen one more time. Where here the any project proposed within the historic preservation overlay zone prior to design review, the zoning administrator shall determine whether the project would result in changes to a cultural resource, and projects that are subject to a cultural resource, it says higher up, are subject to the Old Town Design Guidelines. It says it right below, sorry, in section 17.28.060. Any proposed project within the overlay zone that would result in changes to a cultural resource on the property must comply with the Old Town Design Guidelines. The first question, there's sort of two questions. One, whether or not to limit the application of the Old Town Design Guidelines like they are. One option would just be to say they apply to everything within Old Town Pinole, all projects within Old Town Pinole, and then we can work separately on making sure that the guidelines are not too restrictive or not. The other option would be to keep it as is, and then the question is whether or not the zoning administrator should be the person making the decision as to whether a cultural resource is impacted. They can always, I think one thing to note is like all decisions, the zoning administrator always has the ability to refer that a decision to the planning commission. So if it's a close call or something like that, the planning commissioner, the zoning administrator could always refer that item to the planning commission. And one thing that Mr. Jarvis mentioned, I don't remember if it was there when we were talking with him, I was talking with him earlier, is that, it might be a good idea, not something in the ordinance, but a good idea just for the first few projects to go to the planning commission, just so there's more, public awareness and knowledge about the process. But so that was a long-winded way of saying that the two issues are, one, whether the Old Town Design Guidelines should just apply across the board or only to projects that impact a cultural resource. And then the second question is, what individual or body should be responsible for determining whether a project impacts a cultural resource? So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Mayor.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll tell you my immediate reaction to the first question about whether the guidelines should apply to all. In thinking about an overlay and discussing what structures, what homes, what buildings, whether commercial, residential, occupy that space, that geographic space, I'm thinking that the guidelines as well, because we have that map, apply to all. So that's my immediate reaction. I'd like to hear others' comments about that. Why would some be excluded? Well, thinking about a comment I made earlier, we don't know at this point, any business owner, any private property owner, commercial or residential, may deem their property historic for whatever reason, personal reasons, just appreciation for the architecture, or maybe even having found a photograph of their home from a decade ago, what have you, whatever reason it is. And then there may be some people who just move into the area without any notion. They've simply acquired a home because they can afford it, because they've come to see that property is available. It happens to be in Pinole. It happens to be in this overlay area. They may not necessarily have the awareness or make the distinction as we're trying to do about what is deemed historic. However, they are in that area that provides the variety and the character, et cetera, that we have had a discussion about is considered Old Town Pinole. And for that reason, I'm thinking, let's make it simple enough and have the overlay applies to all the properties in a certain geographic area, then the guidelines apply to all the properties in that same area. So that's my thinking right now. I'm open to committee members' reactions as well, please. Commissioner Moriarty.
Yeah, thank you. The problem is that the Old Town Design Guidelines are aimed at a certain historic era. And so if we go towards the apply to all, then we need to think about those, that development, that, the mid-century development that is west of or below San Pablo Avenue, because then the guidelines, outside of the general guidelines, it would be much more difficult to apply them specifically. The nice thing, though, about the guidelines themselves, and this, we'll get into a discussion of this, I'm sure, in a little bit, but is that they can be generalized. And so that can be really helpful. So I myself lean towards applying it towards all, and then making sure that our design guidelines can apply to all, everything that's within the district. So we might need to rethink the specific wording and such of the guidelines. So that's my thought regarding the first question.
Thank you. And I think from a previous presentation of the ordinance at a council meeting, it was Councilmember Toms who identified a number of different areas where the guidelines could be updated to be consistent with current practice. So, let's hold on to that notion as well. Other committee members, please, on the first question of whether the guidelines ought to apply to all properties in the overlay or not.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, I agree with you and with Ann about if you have a zone, everything should be at a starting point should go towards that zone. Otherwise, there's no point in having a zone at all. And I do think that the guidelines should be more general and more encompassing of various eras. Right now, my gut reaction of reading what I've seen so far, other than the new things that have occurred, that it's right now it's too Victorian centric, and it needs to be spread out as time goes on. It's going to need to encompass other times. I had mentioned to Maureen a few weeks ago about right now a lot of millennials are very into buying these mid-century houses, whether they're Eichlers or houses like we have here, or post-war houses, that kind of thing. And there are lots of books and magazines now on how to restore those types of houses, what to look for and that kind of thing. So there is an interest amongst some of the generations that are coming after us that are already in the position of buying houses that have some interest in that. So our guidelines really need to be more general to pick that up. If I go back to the example of the Manuel Fernandez house, say someone buys that house tomorrow and they want to add a second floor addition to it. So that's I think that one's like a bungalow. And now what kind of say do we have as a city in terms of maintaining the integrity of the zone it's in, or even the house on its own, because someone could put anything on that, so there should be something that would say something about reflecting the existing architecture of, whatever the building is. Now, sometimes that could, of course, backfire, but it's going to depend on the designer. As an example of that, I've seen houses that I've fixed, I guess I'll call it, that look like the houses that were in the green area that were, wood siding and metal windows, stuff like, were just stuccoed in the 70s. And what integrity they had for their time is just gone at that point. So that would be one thing that we wouldn't want to have as a misreading or misintentioning of whatever guidelines we have. So I guess that's kind of, in a weird way, that's kind of saying they have to be general and specific at the same time. So a lot is going to be landing on the head of the zoning administrator. And some will be how we, modify these guidelines to make sure it can fit in all areas, and it may not fit in all areas. We have to say for this type of area or this type of house type, we want this kind of thing to happen. But in this type, we want this other thing to happen. So there'll be, ideally we want to make it general, but there'll probably be a couple of specifics we have to throw into this.
Okay, and that might be, that whether it's a gut reaction or trained professionals' expertise that guides him or her to say, hey, we got to kick this up to the next level of review. Mm-hmm. That may very well be the way to go. Yeah,
and any automatic questioning of whether they do that or not should jump it up to that next level just right on the spot.
All right. So I take it that you are also, if I recall, the first part of your comments that was about applying the overlay to all.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Like I said, otherwise there's no point to having the overlay.
Okay. Thank you. Councilmember Toms, any further comments?
Yeah. Kind of the same idea. I think that since this is very Victorian centric, I would just encourage folks to take a look at Rodeo design guidelines that were put together. And I don't know if in this meeting, if I can add a chat, if it's a public meeting or not, but what they have is they have examples of craftsman homes, and it's, listed as 1905 to 1930. And then they include pictures of windows, porches, stoops, some of the elements that, would really assist on a remodel if there was to be a remodel there. They have the folk Victorian and the modern minimal, and then a modern ranch. And so it could be that there's, possibly some examples, of something that wouldn't be too difficult to include into these design guidelines. And Alex, I don't know if that's something that I should just share with staff. Oh, you're on mute.
If you share it with staff, we can circulate it to everyone.
Okay. Okay, I'll do that.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I think we've answered, the committee has answered that part of the inquiry.
And I think, Mayor, based on the answer you've reached for the first question sort of eliminates the second question because you no longer have to make that distinction. So before we move on, I would say, recommend you see if there's any public comment on any of the items we've discussed so far.
Thank you for that reminder. And again, I see only one attendee being Mr. Rupert. And Mr. Rupert, if you are interested in commenting, please use the raise hand feature to alert staff and or any of us that you do wish to speak. I'll give you a moment to do that if you like. But I'm not seeing that, so I'm going to move on. Oh, no, I see a hand, but that's Commissioner Moriarty's virtual hand.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to make sure that we're very cognizant of process in terms of we are saying that we think that the ordinance should apply to all, but what is the process that the projects will go through? Mr. Mogg said it would go through the same process that we have right now in terms of larger projects going to the Planning Commission and smaller projects going administrative. And so I just want to confirm that that's true. And if there's, discussion or on the administrative side, if there is concern about a certain project, even if it is small, when is the decision made that it does go to the Planning Commission or to a smaller, subcommittee that we have there? So I just want to make sure that if we're not discussing it now, that we do discuss the role of the process.
It looks like Commissioner Moriarty froze.
Yes, she has frozen.
Hopefully she will restart in a moment.
I think she froze at the very moment when she wanted to emphasize our acknowledgement of process.
Well, and that's certainly within, if the mayor would like, that certainly falls within this item. So that is something we could discuss tonight. I would just confirm that as the ordinance is currently drafted, and based on the feedback so far tonight, Commissioner Moriarty is correct that the design review would just go through the normal process. Oversimplifying, but large projects to the Planning Commission. That would include any type of new structure. It includes residential additions of over 500 square feet. So, the example of a second story, I think that probably likely would be over 500 square feet and would go to the Planning Commission. Smaller projects, someone who's replacing a window, someone who is maybe building a small accessory structure, that might go to the zoning administrator. Under the code, the zoning administrator can refer any decision to the Planning Commission. It's really up to his discretion, or of course the zoning administrator's decision, once made, can always be appealed to the Planning Commission, but that does involve a fine. But the zoning administrator has the discretion to confer with the design review subcommittee or to forward it to the whole Planning Commission, but there's no requirement for him to do so under specific circumstances.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know I was frozen too. I think it sounds like I got to say everything I was going to say. But I'm just, thinking about the comments that were brought up at a prior meeting regarding, I guess what I want to make sure is, and this is what I said when we were discussing this during at the Planning Commission level, is that we have, on board now someone who has a lot of experience with historic districts and such like that. Mr. Hannum has that experience. But in the future, I guess if we are applying the design guidelines to everything, then that means that that's the default, right? Mm-hmm. And so that if in the future we have a planning manager who does not have the experience working with, historic communities and such, how much authority who has the final authority, making these decisions? In other words, that window's okay, it fits, that window is not okay. Stuccoing over a mid-century, ranch house is okay or not, those kinds of things. So that's what I mean by process.
Well, I think that's going to be something that would fall on the design review committee. And I think that any planning manager who has a question or is unsure or wants, what happens now is if there's any kind of question, it automatically goes to the design review committee for sure. And it's all weighed in and kind of helps bolster the decision that's made. So you're right, and in the sense that to be aware of process in two ways. One, to make sure we're doing, the appropriate, not just for what we'd like to see, but we don't also want to be too heavy-handed either. As an example, Alameda, anything older than any house or any building older than 1935 automatically gets reviewed by their Historic Preservation Commission. And I've been on seen those kind of meetings where it was completely inappropriate, but that's how they do it. To me, that was heavy-handed. I think we have a pretty decent sort of checks and balance involved with working with our planning manager and the subcommittee because of the diversity of everyone. I think we, in a sense, kind of watch out over each other in terms of that way. I don't think we would, if there was a situation where a planning manager didn't have, say, David's experience, they probably would really be excited that there was someone like a design review committee to fall back on, just to kind of help them out.
Right. Let me give an example of what might be considered appropriate or heavy-handed, in thinking about it, is the fence that was built alongside East Bay Coffee. Mm-hmm. In terms of how that would fit in, and we had different opinions on how that fits in, and it is not reflective of an older historical kind of fence, yet it went through the process and was okayed. So how would that process be different if we had the ordinance and the Old Town design guidelines?
We'd be looking, if we had something like that and there was a question that way, then we start delving into the actual pieces of the project. What kind of materials is it made out of? Is there anything that it's related to that's, with something that if it was supposed to have a historic context, we would see if there was a relationship with that. Those are the two things that I think of right off the top of my head on something like that.
Right. And so who has the authority to make those decisions? Is it just one person, the planning manager, or is it the subcommittee or the planning commission, or in the end, the city council? So,
well, if there was a disagreement between what the planning manager said and what the committee said on something like that, then that would automatically have to go to the planning commission for a review. If there was because right now we've never had a situation where he's like, oh, well, I'm the one with the final say. It's always been a collaborative effort.
So I would just add, if that is the process that the commissioner, right now we have an ad hoc subcommittee that has itself no authority. Mm-hmm. It has no authority. It has been, assigned, to advise the zoning administrator, but it's not mentioned in the municipal code anywhere. The planning commission has authority to make certain decisions, and the zoning administrator has the decision to make certain. The zoning administrator has the authority to make certain decisions. And the zoning administrator has chosen in many situations where it is under his authority to confer with the ad hoc committee. Yeah. And I would assume that would be the case going forward, but as Commissioner Moore already pointed out, they're some way down the road, you don't know what some future zoning administrator might do. And the code right now says, they have the authority to do X, Y, and Z, or the full planning commission has the authority to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, because they can only appeal my decision. I mean, at this point, like say, for example, that I get a project, this is what I want, or this is what I approve, or whatever. The planning commission, if I go to the planning commission subcommittee, I don't like what they say, and I can then rule based on the code and all that. Right now, they can appeal my decision to the full planning commission. They have that ability.
Right.
Right.
And we could create a different process if that is what this committee wants and ultimately the council wants. But I just wanted to clarify, that's the practice right now, Commissioner Banuelos, and I think that has been the practice. That was certainly the practice with Winston when he was here, and I don't have any reason to doubt it would be the practice going forward. But I just want to point out that that's not sort of the black if you got an evil zoning administrator who came in here and said, I have this authority, I can do X, Y, and Z, they would be right under the code. It allows them to do X, Y, and Z without consulting with
Well, tell me this, Alex. If the council or the commission they feel like the ad hoc committee needs to be, at least in this instance, as part of the historic preservation, could we include that as for the administrative, since they can be called on pretty much any time? That's more of a me calling them and bringing them together, or would I have to do it like I would as a zoning administrator, call a special meeting and how? I mean, we could do a process like that.
Yeah. Well, I believe my concern is that once you start giving them decision-making authority, formal legal decision-making authority, it really needs to be a Brown Act meeting that's open to the public and notice. Whereas, that's not the case for a, ad hoc committee that sort of just makes recommendations to whoever it's making recommendations to.
Okay. So it would be. So if we were to do that, then we would set basically a standing committee as a historic preservation subcommittee, at which point they could review administrative style projects less than 500 square feet, or that kind of thing.
And this committee could include members of the public.
Well, then you're asking for a historic preservation committee, because right now we have the commission, we have the committee of three. I mean, the only problem with that, sometimes in small cities, sometimes it's difficult to get those citizen members. I know that's been an issue in some of the cities I've worked in with these additional committees. So not to say that there aren't volunteers out there, but sometimes when we have to dedicate terms, and when these terms are up and people want to get off, other people want to come back on. So
fair enough. I appreciate that. I just want, for us to be thinking, a little bit outside the box too. We have a standard process now. Would that process be different in this overlay district? And we don't, Madam Mayor, I didn't mean to, hijack the discussion in that sense, but I just want to make sure that we do discuss process and we end up, thinking through as we think about the guidelines and the ordinance, how it's implemented. So I appreciate, that discussion.
And Commissioner, I think this is sort of an issue we've discussed some before of, we could create in this process, in this ordinance, a process for the zoning administrator to, sort of notify the planning commission, for example, of, these are the 5, this is a pending decision, this will be finalized in 5 days unless you notify me that it should go to the planning commission, and sort of give any planning commissioner the power to call up an item. We could put that in an ordinance. I think the concern that has existed before is, that potentially creates, delays. It requires, more time, because even though, now the commission is meeting twice a month, it does create, sort of have to put together a staff report and sort of things that might create delays for a smaller project. And, it's up to the committee and ultimately the council as a whole, whether that's something they think is appropriate or not.
So thank you. I don't believe you hijacked this part of the discussion. I think it was important enough for us to all hear what was an issue at the Planning Commission level, that spilled over to the first hearing of the ordinance some time ago, and continues to be on the mind of some of the committee members. I think regardless of what process exists, the reality is or becomes that it's who is involved in those processes that really determines the direction that some action will take. And by that I mean, to the extent that there are preservation-oriented residents on any committee, they may have a certain regard and certain standard for what is deemed appropriate, and compared to someone who enters into this for considering the broader aspects of being part of a planning commission, and then also volunteers as part of a review committee, which is, how land is used and what buildings are there. In any case, any of those individuals have to rely or ought to rely back on something. This takes us to the guidelines. So not being a trained planning professional, just from having read the guidelines, and it's been probably at least 3 times in the last couple of months, I keep gaining something from doing that. So not to minimize the familiarity that's necessary with the guidelines, and not to minimize how generalizable they can be, so that they are applicable across different architectural styles. So let's get into that. I think if we've had a bit of discussion now about process, maybe come back to it later. But I think the process is hold up. It's let's get into the into the guideline discussion and see where we might need to update those or make them more consistent with what we believe ought to be the direction to be given to council, not to council. The next level of discussion that we need to have. Thank you, Alex, and everyone.
So I'll just pull up the guidelines.
And as you're doing that, Alex, I know we're going to go through some finalization of any of these documents, but the ordinances have a couple of typos in them as well. Yeah.
So these, I'll just leave it here. I know the Old Town Design Guidelines, I'm sure you've all looked at them. They've sort of broken out into different types, commercial, new residential, existing commercial, pretty limited and very broad guidelines for sort of existing residential, just the renovation section basically, which has some pretty broad guidelines that aren't as specific as some of the other categories. And I know Councilmember Tom's had some specific items, so up to the discretion of the mayor and the committee. But I don't know if you prefer to just go page by page, or have go committee member by committee member, discussing items.
Okay, if we can go section by section, which takes us to possibly page by page, and then have committee members let us know what they observed or what they recognized needed either an update, or was questionable, or was inconsistent with the intent of the ordinance.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I guess we can start with just section 1. I don't know if this is I think out of date, and we could update this based on moving forward if we wanted, or just take this part out completely. This was a little describes how they were adopted originally. So we could add, and they were modified in 2021. I forgot the year there for a moment. I don't know if there are any specific items on this. This is really, sort of, for lack of a better word, non-substantive, sort of the introduction. So I don't know if anyone has any meaningful or pressing comments on these sections. It doesn't look like it. So with that, and we would of course change this map to reflect. You can see here too the homes are excluded there. So we would change this map to reflect the current map. Section 2 is just the description of the area. I don't think there'd be any reason to change that. And then Section 3.
Yeah, this is where I had some comments.
Yeah.
And I don't know if Anne has some too.
Yeah, Anne, your hand's been up virtually.
Oh no, I'll take it down. I'll take it down. I'm sorry. I forgot to lower it. Please, Maureen, go ahead.
Okay, in the third paragraph is where it starts talking about design review board. We just need to update that to either the planning commission or subcommittee of the planning commission or whatever entity that's going to be. And then I don't think we call the department the community development department anymore. I think there's an updated name.
Well, actually, it went back to community development. It was development services, but now that we've done the reorganization, it's back to community development.
Okay.
I did have one question, and we kind of flew through chapter 2 in terms of commercial design themes or residential design themes. So we're talking and using the, right rehab, City of Oakland in terms of different styles. We just have the 3, like you said, they're more of the, Queen Anne, hip roof, and bungalows.
Yeah, we need to add the other ones.
Yeah. So we can update that.
Yeah, section 2.3. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I think that the discussion in that would have to change as well to include the mid-century architecture that as being, I didn't realize that was the first development in Pinole. So that's cool. So if we look at 2.3 being revised or updated.
Right. That's what we do. We would add the different styles of residential development in there so that it's consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
In section 3.1, on the planning commission, we had a discussion regarding language and what the meanings of the words are. And I think that, that we had changed should, encouraged, discouraged, and must. But off the top of my head, I don't remember.
Oh.
Well, one of the things about this is we need to make sure we're parallel with the regular design guidelines, because we went through this when we were doing that set, 13 years ago. And there was a lot of time spent on when you say shall or must or whatever. So if we do this, we have to make sure we're in parallel with the other design guidelines. And also if we find something that's going to be better that works for both, we might want to modify those as well in terms of the language. Mm-hmm. Maureen, I don't know if you remember this, but we went through a long time of dealing with that when we worked with this.
Yeah, good point.
Because it's a very legal kind of designation.
Sorry about that.
Right back.
Reshare this again.
Are you going to scroll the document a bit more for us, Alex?
Oh yeah, I was just sorry. I was just going for Commissioner Moriarty. What changed is that what the Planning Commission's recommendation was just guidelines which employ the word should are intended to be mandatory.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sorry about that. And then, I froze for a moment, but are we still at the section 3?
Yeah, we talked a bit about language. You just clarified a bit more.
There's a little more design review board references that need to be nixed.
Yeah, well, all of those will be corrected. I'll just slowly go through. So section 4 is where we begin more substantive. So commercial guidelines for new construction.
And this is probably, in terms of most recent history, we should have been using this because it's been from the 90s on. There were a lot of buildings that were done with redevelopment money from that period. They're all over Old Town that may or may not have had the benefit of review using these guidelines of whatever form they were in at that time. Some of that predates them. It predates the 1997 date on this. But if anything, this is going to be the part that we will all probably have to look at the most closely in terms of future development immediately downtown. We have lots right now that have been in the process off and on of being sold that are very dominant and are going to be commercial properties. And this is where we probably, generally speaking, both sets of guidelines are kind of more residential based, but this is one where we want to spend some time on in terms of what we want as a commercial base in terms of, especially particularly in Old Town. I mean, it's kind of vaguely mentioned in the specific area plans, which is fine. But here, I think this is the one place where we may want to be more specific.
Yeah, I can absolutely relate to that because I do not recall taking a look at this document when we, as commissioners, me being part of the Planning Commission, were considering and deliberating over the ophthalmology site across from Sprouts. And yet I saw one single statement in these guidelines, as old as they are, that referenced the preference to not have an all-white building.
Yeah. Well, that goes all the way back even to when they built the Kaiser building, and even not that was anything of any controversy with that, but I'm pretty sure this wasn't looked at when that was all done from the entire development there.
Yeah. And again, I'll make a point of saying that as a non-planning person, not professionally trained planner, when I read these guidelines, they speak to an interest in compatibility, a sense of place, a maintenance of character. I don't see how they are problematic, but I will turn to staff to let us to help inform the updates as well. But they seem to me rather flexible, as well as having some sort of needing to be updated with the terms that we now use, like the design review committee, for example. But they seem to be useful even now. Councilmember Thoms.
Yeah, as you say that, it makes me think that, there's a lot of proposed legislation that wouldn't allow sort of that flexibility. So if there's any recommendations to make these, build in some objectivity where it's necessary, I would ask the planners to do that.
And I would just add that in general, that objectivity would, where you have trouble enforcing subjective requirements under new state law, tends to be from multifamily housing, new multifamily housing. So like the commercial restrictions, probably wouldn't be impacted in any way. And sort of most residential that already exists wouldn't be particularly impacted as well, with the exception being, which I think we've discussed before, of ADUs. We can sort of make these as suggestions to the people building the ADUs, but if they want to completely ignore it, and unless we have objective standards for that, it becomes easy for them.
And with that, my next comment is on page 14, so others might have comments before that.
No, mine follow.
No, my only comment is the importance on page 11, the importance of compatible with the character of the existing neighborhood, and that is where we can get into the different kinds of developments and the different neighborhoods that exist. Although this is commercial, so, and the developments we were talking of were never mind, they're residential, so it doesn't apply. But still, fitting with the neighborhood is important.
Okay.
Well, I think it would apply still, because mixed in with the Old Town overlay, we also still have the mixed, the special or specific area plan. So there's going to be a little bit of a crossover in there where we're going to have both. So that's another thing. Do we need them, as we go through this, are we going to be in a position to modify the specific area plans if there's a conflict between those and the Old Town guidelines? I don't, I'm just kind of throwing that out there. I don't have an answer or anything, but it's almost like we may have to have a separate category just for multifamily and pull it out of commercial, because there are so many. So that thing is it's a moving target right now at the state, and we may have to deal with that on its own. I know we've had some things already that we've looked at in the Planning Commission in terms of some of the larger developments where there were things that were kind of required by the state in the guise of things that they're going to be allowed to do, and density bonuses and parking bonuses and things like that are currently just kind of fly against our own sense of what we want to have, and generate things like, as an example, that one 33-unit property that was on San Pablo Avenue that's kind of across where Sugar City was, where they wanted half their parking. They were allowed to do that, but that would have had a immense impact on everybody around there, including that neighborhood right next to them. People would end up parking in that neighborhood, and the people there were very vocal about what they thought about that. So, there are conditions where we're kind of in a sense of our hands being somewhat tied on that, but at the same time, we need to kind of figure something out in terms of multifamily guidelines, just to make sure that we can kind of handle the things that are kind of just getting thrust upon us.
With you all having said this, can we just make a note for if the committee's okay with this, because the matter has been raised, for us to take an extra look at the compatibility of these guidelines with the specific area plans. And my question right now is there any space for multifamily developments in Old Town? I'm not certain, but just in case, that would be another matter to concern ourselves with, and possibly the next meeting.
Yeah, well, there were places that were identified as opportunity sites where they were mixed use, which would be kind of generically different than what one would think about when you think of Old Town as your first thought. But they were identified in the specific area plans.
And there's somewhat of an intersection overlap with Old Town, right?
There has to be, because we have two overlays in the same place.
Yeah. So let's definitely take a look at that as well. Next meeting, possibly. I know it's separate, but it is related, and I think it may come up as an issue. Okay.
Yeah, you don't want developers playing divide and conquer with our guidelines and ordinances.
So continuing to scroll.
Does anyone, I believe it was page 15 is where Councilmember Tom's
14.
14.
Page 14. So my only questions here is we're talking about maximum building height. Should be 2 stories and 35 feet, and then a maximum building height of 3 stories and 40 feet may be remitted if the 3rd story volume is enclosed, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just wondering if we need to take a look, and do we need to update that to make it consistent with the specific plan? I'm not sure that it is inconsistent, but I just want to highlight it to make sure that it we make sure it's consistent.
Oh yeah, it's definitely inconsistent from what's there. And then we have to kind of deal with, well, what if some developer wants to put something out there that's within the zone and they want a height consideration, which could be contrary to our guidelines.
And so,
I mean, just to give you in the San Pablo corridor, buildings can be as high as 40 feet or 3 stories, 50 or 4 stories. There are some building height exceptions to go higher. But there's also some setback requirements as part of that special height requirement. So
I just think we need to take a look at this and make it consistent with what our code actually says.
And I do believe, I won't scroll up, but I believe one of the changes we made after the Planning Commission raised a similar thing was just sort of a blanket statement in case these inconsistencies exist elsewhere that, if there's an inconsistency between general plan, specific plan, or what's in the municipal code and these guidelines, those other documents would control because they're higher in the hierarchy, so to speak. But we'll certainly make the change here and anyplace else that we discover those inconsistencies.
So you're saying then that the specific plans would be the overarching document then, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even having a statement like that in the introduction to these guidelines is helpful. It's a very useful tidbit of information. That hierarchy. Who knows the hierarchy? Who wants to know the hierarchy? Who ought to know the hierarchy? Right?
Oh yeah, all the above.
Yes.
I know on page 16, the Planning Commission number 2 suggested a change. New buildings are encouraged to contain 3 parts. To strike should.
Oh, you said 16, sorry.
That takes us back to the legality, the use of the terms.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And whether there's merit to using the shoulds.
I think I'd also kind of know what was meant by, a base, a midsection, and a top. I can do that in 10 feet of a building and say I comply, as opposed to an entire building as designed. What's that mean there? Because if I were an architect coming in, that'd be the first thing I'd ask about this. What do you mean by that?
So who knows the answer to that? Who would be expected to know the answer to that? Okay.
I would have to point to a planner.
Is there a better way to convey that?
Well, you have to decide whether you're talking about the overall building concept or details. And if it seems to me the intent was that this is something that's for an entire building, but it's a little, it's not clear.
Well, I mean, the figures kind of help out in that regard in terms of what the top, in terms of the, base, the 3 sections. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, as if you submitted a building to me, I'd be telling you that you need at least, 3 parts of the building. So,
yeah, I don't like any of these pictures you guys they're showing on this. No, I think they're bad examples. But of course, they're from 1997. So, what do you say?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is why that was confusing to me, because I look at that and kind of look at the pictures, kind of go, eh.
You architects, no.
Well, could we offer less ambiguous images?
Sure, we could always change the pictures.
We're talking about updating this, right? Here's our opportunity to do that.
Yeah, we'll take a look at some different pictures and different things.
They could be sketches like this. It could be photos, It could be examples of cities around, or buildings around the city that we have now that fall into this. Right. That would be the best way to do it if we can find them.
So in a couple of minutes, I want to do a time check, and regardless of where we are, it seems like we will continue reviewing as we are with the comments from the committee also at a next meeting. Yeah.
My next comment's on page 20. I don't know if anybody has anything in between there. It's on 4.3A2. And just kind of thinking about, crime prevention through environmental design aspects. You don't necessarily want to have if you have a duplex and you have a second story entrance, I don't think you want to have it in the back. You want to have it where it's more visible. So, there may be a better, I don't know if it's deleted or if there's a better description of how we want to have that second floor entrance. If it's part of a duplex. And I would think it's on Prune Street on the creek side of Tennant Avenue. There's a nice example of a 2-story duplex with the door in the front. And, I would hesitate to have them do something different just because the design guidelines don't speak specifically to that kind of design.
Well, you could always say something like the entrances being visible from the street, and also probably make some sort of comment about lighting. That would kind of go along with that. I'm trying to, at the same time, I was trying to figure out why did they say this in the first place? Would they say this should be placed at the rear or the side? It might have just been from those times,
Yeah, and it might be just, if it's a single unit, you probably don't want to have a second story, back entrance. But if it's a duplex, it's different.
Well, or if you have if you have a commercial on the bottom and residential on top.
Yeah.
So you don't want to. I mean, that's probably where that came from. But we can kind of look at different styles of architecture to where we might just have everything like in the olden days when they had the stairways were covered up by doors, so you had to go indoors to go in the stairway up to like the next level. So it gave you that office or that commercial based on the bottom, but when you open the door, you go up the stairs. So something of that nature.
Yeah,
you can include something like that.
And then we have to make sure we have some way to deal with it if someone just brings something that they can't at all do that, because there's 2 buildings next to it. There's no way to get, not to do what we're supposed to do or whatever, or the front's too small, but there's room in the back to come in. There's always going to be some kind of variation. So we need a mechanism to deal with the variation. We have to say, if it's in the back and you can't do it this way. You just need to have the variation, the mechanism rather, sorry.
Right.
Because that's a common zoning error that all cities have, is where they're too absolute and you find out you can't do it, and then someone has to do a variance because the zoning ordinance was written wrong.
Or not relevant at the time, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In this case, this is more of a relevance issue, this more than anything else now.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a good point.
My next comment isn't till page 24.
Okay.
Under 4.4A2, landscaping should generally consist of live plants. I think we need to put native drought tolerant.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really old, isn't it?
Yeah.
The same is to number 5 on there. Existing mature trees should be preserved, etc.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yes.
I'm just going to scroll up really, I think. Yeah, so here we did, I think that particular one, Commissioner Moriarty, we did.
Planning Commission, yeah.
Yeah, that. But we'll add about the drought resistant language as well.
Yeah.
Sorry to scroll through this so quickly. Hopefully,
no, that's good that that's there. The number 5 is always kind of hard to do because you always run into the commercial project that needs to see their signage and there's a big tree in the way.
Yeah.
And so the first thing they ask for is to nix the tree.
And then number 7, the use of native and drought-resistant plants, shrubs, and trees is encouraged. Should we change that to required?
We did. We changed it to shall.
You guys are good.
That's good. Yeah.
Good planning commission. And then on the next section about parking and circulation, I think we need to add something about bike parking. And the sample that I sent David and Michael, I think has some examples of bike parking that might be useful. I don't think we have to solve it here.
If you look at page 27, that addresses bike parking.
Oh. Okay, thank you.
Number
I think I just
2.
made that comment too early then.
Well, maybe, but maybe what you provided might be a little bit more, I'm not sure what the word is, but might be better than the wording that's here. So
okay,
taking that into account.
Well, it needs to be updated. Yeah. Do we also need to say anything about places for people to plug in their electric cars?
Yeah.
Or is that a function of a much larger project?
I was thinking the exact same thing. Yeah, we should probably add that to the parking.
And with, I think there was a section C3 on page 27. Are there any other acts, more current acts that have come into play that we have to be cognizant of?
Well, the Uniform Building Code now is the California Building Code. And that's actually going to take precedence over ADA unless it's a federally funded building, because the California Building Code in some places is more restrictive than the ADA. So although Chapter 11B in the Building Code is Chapter 4 of the ADA, where all that stuff lands.
Yeah.
So with
I was just going to say, all they do is they took it out. And
they plugged it in. That's because in 2007 there were massive mistakes in when they did all that. Yeah. So they gave up on it, and so they put the ADA in. But there are still things within that have been increased in severity. So California has the most restrictive accessibility requirements in the country. So they use ADA as the model and did it. So we have to kind of, you could say you can't say you have to say American Disability Act and the California Building Code.
And if we can end at page 54 and leave the remaining time to agree on the next items on our agenda, which would be, for one, continuing the review of these guidelines as we are doing. Okay. And the other matter that was brought up was taking a look at the compatibility with the with the specific area.
Specific, right.
Those two things. And I want to come back, Alex, if you would help us, please. Did we answer all the questions that we were to consider and discuss at this meeting?
You certainly answered my questions. Commissioner Moriarty raised an additional issue that I don't quite think the committee, reached a consensus on, or didn't discuss it in depth at all. That's something we could add to the next agenda as well, whether we want to change the process at all, or anything like that.
Okay, and was that related to the question of management by zoning administrator or planning commission?
Yeah, no, I think it is related, but I think it sort of became more of what process do we want to use? How do we want the design review guidelines to apply? Do we want them to just be applied through the existing design review process, or should there be a unique process for properties in this overlay zone?
Okay, are we settled then on the question of management by the zoning administrator or planning commission?
Yeah, well, so because we're applying because we're applying the design review guidelines across the whole. Sorry, the light went out. Because we're applying the design review guidelines across the whole overlay zone, there no longer is a decision point for them. There used to be, they had to decide whether or not a cultural resource was impacted, and that would trigger or not trigger the design review guidelines being applicable. But because we're just applying them uniformly, we can take that step out.
Okay, just want to make sure that I and certainly the rest of the committee members understand that as well. Okay. Any remaining questions from committee members based on the discussion that we've had today, or items that you see we haven't mentioned that ought to be on our agenda for the next meeting? Well, thank you.
Only that I think on the ordinance, we took out the incentives. Is that correct? They were crossed out on the one that was provided today, and I just wanted to confirm that we did cross out those incentives, right?
We did, and that stemmed from the last meeting that we had.
Right.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, good.
Yeah.
So, Norma, did you say we're going to start with section 5 next time?
Whatever page we ended, I think we ended on page 27, so we're going to continue on page 28, whatever section that falls under.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll just keep going as we have. Thank you, everyone, for that. I think it worked out for us that way.
Okay.
All right. Well then.
Dave, I think we're on the last item of the agenda, the adjourn portion.
Did Dave want to adjourn?
No, I was just. I think we were back in the agenda item, so I wanted to.
Yeah.
Oh, on the slides, yes.
Yeah, the slides. Yeah.
Okay, committee members, thank you for your time. Staff, thank you for your time. Alex, thank you for guiding us through this. And I hereby adjourn the meeting until the next meeting to be scheduled. Thank you all for being responsive to the surveys that are being sent out to try to maximize our time together and identify when we all coincide on time availability.
And I'll send out that email either tomorrow or Thursday so we can get that scheduled quickly.
Super.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you to Jonathan Jarvis for sharing his time.
Yeah, that was good.
That was a great start. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
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 Good night, everybody.